The Story of Civilization, Part 2. The Life of Greece, being a history of Greek civilization from the beginnings and of civilization in the Near East from the death of Alexander to the Roman conquest, with an introduction on the prehistoric culture of Crete by Will Durant. Chapter 2. Before Agamemnon, Part 1. Schliemann. In the year 1822 of the Common Era, a lad was born in Germany who was to turn the spadework of archaeology into one of the romances of the century. His father had a passion for ancient history and brought him up on Homer's stories of the siege of Troy and Odysseus' wanderings. With grief, I heard from him that Troy had been so completely destroyed that it had disappeared without leaving any trace of its existence. At the age of 8, having given the matter mature consideration, Heinrich Schliemann announced his intention to devote his life to the rediscovery of the lost city. At the age of 10, he presented to his father a Latin essay on the Trojan War. In 1836, he left school with an education too advanced for his means and became a grocer's apprentice. In 1841, he shipped from Hamburg as a cabin boy on a steamer bound for South America. 12 days out, the vessel foundered. The crew was tossed about in a small boat for 9 hours and was thrown by the tide upon the shores of Holland. Heinrich became a clerk and earned $150 a year. He spent half of this on books and lived on the other half and his dreams. His intelligence and application had their natural results. At 25, he was an independent merchant with interest on 3 continents. At 36, he felt that he had enough money, retired from commerce, and gave all his time to archaeology. In the midst of the bustle of business, I had never forgotten Troy, or the agreement I had made with my father to excavate it. In his travels as a merchant, he had made it a practice to learn the language of each country he traded with, and to write in that language the current pages of his diary. By this method, he learned English, French, Dutch, Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, Russian, Swedish, Polish, and Arabic. Now he went to Greece, studied the language as a living speech, and was soon able to read both ancient and modern Greek as fluently as German. Henceforth, he declared, I should find it impossible to live anywhere but on classical soil. Since his Russian wife refused to leave Russia, he advertised for a Greek wife, laid down precise specifications for the position, and at the age of 47 chose a bride of 19 from among the photographs he received. He married her almost at sight, and unwittingly, in the ancient style of purchase, her parents charged him for her a price commensurate with their conception of his fortune. When his new wife bore him children, he reluctantly consented to baptize them, but solemnized the ceremony by laying a copy of the Iliad upon their heads and reading 100 hexameters aloud. He named them Andromache and Agamemnon, called his servants Telamon and Pelops. He christened his Athenian home Bellerophon. He was an old man, mad about Homer. In 1870, he went to Troad, the northwest corner of Asia Minor, and made up his mind, against all current scholarly opinion, that Priam's Troy lay buried under the hill called Hisarlik. After a year of negotiations, he secured permission from the Turkish government to explore the site. He engaged 80 laborers and set to work. His wife, who loved him for his eccentricities, shared his toil in the earth from sunrise to sunset. All winter long, an icy gale from the north drove a blinding dust into their eyes, and sweat with such violence through the cracks of their frail cottage that no lamp could be kept lit in the evening, despite the fire in the hearth. The water froze nearly every night. We had nothing to keep us warm, except our enthusiasm for the great work of discovering Troy. In order to acquire quickly the Greek vocabulary, Schliemann writes, I procured a modern Greek translation of Paul et Virginie and read it quickly through, comparing every word with its equivalent in the French original. When I had finished this task, I knew at least one half of the Greek words the book contained, and after repeating the operation, I knew them all, or nearly so, without having lost a single minute by being obliged to use a dictionary. Of the Greek grammar, I learned only the declensions and the verbs, and never lost my precious time in studying its rules. For as I saw that boys, after being troubled and tormented for 8 years and more in school with the tedious rules of grammar, can nevertheless none of them write a letter in ancient Greek without making hundreds of atrocious blunders, I thought the method pursued by the schoolmasters must be altogether wrong. I learned ancient Greek as I would have learned a living language. A year passed before they were rewarded. Then blow by blow, a workman's pick exposed a large copper vessel, and this, opened, revealed an astonishing treasure of some 9,000 objects in silver and gold. The canny Schliemann hid the find in his wife's shawl, dismissed his workmen to an unexpected siesta, hurried to his hut, locked the door, spread out the precious things on the table, linked each one fondly with some passage in Homer, adorned his wife with an ancient diadem, and sent messages to his friends in Europe that he had unearthed the treasury of Priam. No one would believe him. Some critics charged him with having placed the objects where he found them, and at the same time the Sublime Porte sued him for taking gold from Turkish soil. But scholars like Virchow, Dortfeld, and Bernouf came to the site, verified Schliemann's reports, and carried on the work with him until one buried Troy after another was discovered, and the problem was no longer whether Troy had existed, but which of the 9 Troys exhumed had been the Ilios of the Iliad. In 1876, Schliemann resolved to confirm the epic from another direction, to show that Agamemnon was too real. Guided by Pausanias's classic description of Greece, Pausanias traveled through Greece about 160 of the Common Era and described it in his Periegesis or tour. He sank 34 shafts at Mycena in the eastern Peloponnesus. Turkish officials interrupted the work by claiming half of the material that he had found at Troy. Unwilling to let the precious treasury of Priam lie unseen in Turkey, Schliemann clandestinely dispatched the objects to the State Museum at Berlin, paid the Porte 5 times more damages than were required of him, and resumed his digging at Mycena. Again he was rewarded, and when he saw his workers carrying up to him skeletons, pottery, jewelry, and golden masks, he telegraphed joyfully to the king of Greece that he had discovered the tombs of Atreus and Agamemnon. In 1884, he moved on to Tiryns and, guided again by Pausanias, unearthed the great palace and cyclopean walls that Homer had described. Seldom had any man done so much for archaeology. He had the faults of his virtues, for his enthusiasm drove him into a reckless haste that destroyed or confused many exhumed objects in order to reach at once the goal that he sought, and the epochs that had inspired his labors misled him into thinking that he had discovered Priam's hoard at Troy and the tomb of Agamemnon at Mycena. The world of scholarship doubted his reports, and the museums of England, Russia, and France long refused to accept as genuine the relics that he had found. He consoled himself with vigorous self-appreciation and went on digging courageously until disease struck him down. In his last days he hesitated whether to pray to the god of Christianity or to the Zeus of classical Greece. Well, some people would say that they're both representations of the same archetype, or the same archetype in different cultures that limits a facet of what divinity really is. To Agamemnon, Schliemann, best beloved of sons, greeting, he writes, I am very glad that you are going to study Plutarch and have finished Xenophon. I praise Zeus, the Father, and Pallas Athene, that they will grant you 100 returns of the day in health and happiness. He died in 1890, worn out by climatic hardships, scholastic hostility, and the incessant fever of his dream. Like Columbus, he had discovered a world stranger than the one he had sought. These jewels were older by many centuries than Priam and Hecuba. These graves were not the tombs of the Atridae, but the ruins of an Aegean civilization on the Greek mainland, as ancient as the Minoan age in Crete. Unknowingly, Schliemann had proved Horace's famous line, Vixerunt fortes ante Agamemnon. There lived many brave men before Agamemnon. Toward the end of his life, Dortfeld and Virchow almost convinced him that he had found the remains not of Agamemnon, but of a far earlier generation. After many heartaches, Schliemann took the matter good-naturedly. What, he exclaimed, so this is not Agamemnon's body, these are not his ornaments? All right, let's call him Shoals. And thereafter, they always spoke of Shoals. Year by year, as Dortfeld and Muller, Desantas and Stamaticus, Waldstein and Weiss dug more widely into the Peloponnesus, and still others explored Attica and the islands, Euboea and Boeotia, Phasis and Thessaly. The soil of Greece gave up the ghostly relics of a culture before history. Here too men had been lifted from barbarism to civilization by the passage from nomadic hunting to settled agriculture, by the replacement of stone tools with copper and bronze, by the conveniences of writing and the stimulus of trade. Civilization is always older than we think, and under whatever sod we tread are the bones of men and women who also worked and loved, wrote songs, and made beautiful things, but whose names and very being have been lost in the careless flow of time. Part 2. In the palaces of the kings. On a long low hill 5 miles east of Argos and a mile north of the sea stood, in the 14th century before our era, the fortress palace of Tiryns. Today, one reaches its ruins by a pleasant ride from Argos or Nauplia. One finds them half lost amid quiet fields of corn and wheat. Then, after a little climb up prehistoric stone steps, the traveler stands before the Cyclopean walls built, said Greek tradition, for the Argive prince Proetus 2 centuries before the Trojan War. The Greeks gave the name Cyclopean to such structures as in their mythical fancy could have been built only by giants, like the one-eyed Titans called Cyclopses, round eyes, who labored at the forge of Hephaestus in the volcanoes of the Mediterranean. Architecturally, the term implied large, unmortared stones, unhewn or roughly cut, and filled in at the joints with pebbles laid in clay. Tradition added that Proetus had imported celebrated masons called Cyclops from Lycia. Even then, the town itself was old, having been founded, said ancient memory, by the hero Tyrannus, son of Argus, of the 100 Eyes. In the infancy of the world, Proteus, with the story went on, gave the palace to Perseus, who ruled Tyrannus with the dusky Andromeda as his queen. The walls that protected the citadel rose from 25 to 50 feet in height and were so thick that at several places they contained spacious galleries, vaulted and arched with immense overlapping horizontal slabs. Many of the stones still in place measure 6 feet in length by 3 in breadth and depth. The smallest of them, said Pausanias, could hardly be moved by a pair of mules. Within the walls, behind a pylon or gateway that set a style for many an acropolis, lay a broad paved court bounded with colonnades, and around this, as at Knossos, was a medley of rooms gathered about the Megaron, a hall of state, 1,300 square feet in area, with a pavement of painted cement and a ceiling supported by 4 columns enclosing a hearth. Here, in contrast to merry Crete, was established a lasting principle of Greek architecture, the separation of women's quarters, or gynaecium, from the chambers of the men. The king's room and the queen's room were built side by side, but so far as the remains reveal, they were hermetically sealed against intercommunication of this palace castle. Schliemann found only the ground plan, the column bases, and portions of the wall. At the foot of the hill were the remnants of stone or brick houses and bridges, and some fragments of archaic pottery. There, in prehistoric days, the town of Tyrannus huddled for protection below the palace walls. We must picture the life of Bronze Age Greece as moving insecurely around and within such feudal fortresses. 10 miles farther north, perhaps in the 14th century, before Christ, before the Common Era. Christ is an amalgamation of at least 4 historical characters, but Perseus, if we wish to believe Pausanias, built Mycena, the greatest capital of prehistoric Greece. Here, too, around a forbidding citadel, a town of several villages grew, housing a busy population of peasants, merchants, artisans, slaves, who had the happiness of eluding history. 600 years later, Homer called Mycena a well-lit city, broad avenued and abounding in gold. Despite 100 despoiling generations, some parts of these also Cyclopean walls survive to attest the immemorial cheapness of labor and uneasiness of kings. In a corner of the wall is the famous Lion's Gate, where carved upon a stone triangle over massive lintel, 2 royal beasts, now worn and headless, dumbly stand guard over a grandeur that is gone. So you see that motif in history. It's not, oh, these were the Jews were. But that's what people tend to think, right? And now there's that Lion's Gate thing, the New Agers, On the Acropolis beyond are the ruins of the palace. Again, as at Tyrannus and Knossos, we can trace the divisions of the throne room, altar room, storerooms, bathroom, and reception rooms. Here once were painted floors, columned porticos, frescoed walls, and majestic flights of stairs. Near the Lion's Gate, in a narrow area enclosed by a ring of erect stone slabs, Schliemann's workers dug up 19 skeletons and relics so rich that one could forgive the great amateur for seeking in these shafts the burial chambers of the children of Atreus. Had not Pausanias described the royal graves as in the ruins of Mycena? Here were male skulls with crowns of gold and golden masks on the bones of the face. Here were Asius ladies with golden diadems. Asius? on what had been their heads. Here were painted vases, bronze cauldrons, a silver rhyton, beads of amber and amethyst, objects of alabaster, ivory, are faience, heavenly ornamented daggers and swords, a gaming board like that at Knossos, and almost anything in gold, seals and rings, pins and studs, cups and beads, bracelets and breastplates, vessels of toilet, even clothing embroidered with thin plates of gold. These were assuredly royal jewels, royal bones. In the hillside opposite the Acropolis, Schliemann and others discovered 9 tombs altogether different from these shaft graves, leaving the road that comes down from the citadel. One enters at the right, a corridor lined with walls of large, well-cut stones. At the end is a plain portal, once adorned with the slim, cylindrical columns of green marble, now in the British Museum. Above it is a simple lintel of 2 stones, one extending 30 feet and weighing 113 tons. Within, the traveler finds himself under a dome, or thalus, 50 feet high and as many wide. The walls are built of sawn blocks, reinforced with decorative bronze rosettes. Each stratum of stone overlaps the one beneath, until the uppermost layer closes the top. This strange structure, Schliemann thought, was the tomb of Agamemnon, and the smaller thalus nearby, discovered by his wife, was at once described as the tomb of Clytemnestra. All the beehive tombs at Macna were found empty. Thieves had anticipated the archaeologists by several centuries. These gloomy ruins are the remainders of a civilization as ancient to Pericles as Charlemagne to ourselves. Current opinion dates the shaft graves near to 1600 BCE, some 400 years before the traditional age of Agamemnon, and the beehive tombs about 1450 BCE. But prehistoric chronology is not a precision tool. We do not know how this civilization began, nor what people it was that built towns, not only at Macna and Tiryns, but at Sparta, Amycla, Aegina, Eleusis, Chaeronea, Orchomenos, and Delphi. Perhaps, like most nations, it was already composite in stock and heritage. Greece was as diverse in blood before the Dorian invasion, 1100 BCE, as England before the Norman conquest. So far as we can guess, the Macedonians were akin to the Phrygians and Carians of Asia Minor, and to the Minoans of Crete. The lions of Macna have a Mesopotamian countenance. This ancient motif probably came through Assyria and Phrygia to Greece. Greek tradition called the Macedonians Pelasgi, probably meaning people of the sea, Pelagus, and pictured them as coming down from Thrace and Thessaly and Attica and the Peloponnesus in a past so distant that the Greeks termed them autochthonoi, aborigines. Herodotus accepted this account and ascribed the Olympian gods to Pelasgic origin, but he could not say with any certainty what the language of the Pelasgi was, no more can we. Doubtless. If there's any update to what it says in this book, comment. Or if you know any other information, that's what the comments are for. Doubtless these autochthonoi were themselves latecomers into a land that had suffered cultivation since Neolithic days. There are no aborigines. In their turn, they too were overrun, for in the later years of the Macedonian history, towards 1600, we find many indications of a cultural, commercial, if not a military political conquest of the Peloponnesus by the products are immigrants of Crete. The palaces at Tiryns and Mycna, except for the Kanakium, were designed and decorated in the Minoan manner. Cretan vases and styles reach into Aegina, Chalkis, and Thebes. Mycenaean ladies and goddesses adopted the charming fashions of Crete, and the art revealed in the latter shaft graze is unmistakably Minoan. Apparently, it was this stimulating contact with a higher culture that lifted Mycenae to the peak of its civilization. Part 3. Mycenaean civilization. The remains of this culture are too fragmentary to give us a picture as distinct as those that take form in the ruins of Crete are the pottery of Homer. Life on the mainland was a little nearer to the hunting stage than in Crete. The bones of deer, wild boars, goats, sheep, hares, oxen, and pigs among the Mycenaean leavings, not to speak of fish bones and marine shells, indicate an appetite already Homeric and unfriendly to Cretan waste. Here and there, the relics reveal the strange contemporaneity of ancient and modern modes, obsidian arrowheads lying beside a hollow bronze drill apparently used in boring dowel holes into stones. Industry was less advanced than in Crete. There are no signs on the mainland of such industrial centers as Gurina. Trade grew slowly through the seas, were troubled with pirates, including the Mycenaeans. The kings of the Mycenae and Tiryns had Cretan artists engrave for them on the vases and rings a proud record of their achievements in piracy. To protect themselves against other pirates, they built their cities inland, far enough from the sea to guard against sudden attack, close enough to take readily to their ships. Lying on the road from the Argolic Gulf to the Isthmus of Corinth, Tiryns and Mycenae were well situated both to plunder traders with feudal tolls and to set out occasionally on buccaneering raids. Seeing Crete grow rich on orderly trade, Mycenae learned that piracy, like its civilized offspring, tariff dues can strangle commerce and internationalize poverty. It reformed and allowed piracy to subside into trade. By 1400, its mercantile fleet was strong enough to defy the sea power of Crete. It refused to ship its Africa-bound goods across the island, but sent them directly to Egypt. Possibly this was the cause or result of a war that ended in the destruction of the Cretan citadels. The wealth that grew from this trade was not accompanied by any commensurate culture visible in the remains. Greek tradition credited at the Pelasgians with having learned the alphabet from the Phoenician traders. At Tiryns and Thebes, some jars have been found bearing unintelligible characters, but no clay tablets or instructions or documents have been discovered. Probably when Mycenae decided to be literate, it used perishable writing materials, as the Cretans did in their final period. And nothing has been preserved. In art, the Mycenaeans followed Cretan models, and so faithfully that archaeology suspects them of importing their major artists from Crete. But after Cretan art declined, painting flourished vigorously on the mainland. The decorative designs of borders and cornices are of the first order and persist into classical Greece, while the surviving frescoes indicate a keen feeling for moving life. The ladies in the box are splendid dowagers who might adorn any opera promenade today and be in full fashion of coiffure and gowns. They are more alive than the stiffly conscious ladies in the chariot. who are out for an afternoon drive in the park. Better still is the boar hunt, a fresco from Tiran's. The boar and the flowers are unconvincingly conventional. The incredible pink hounds are disfigured with stylized spots of scarlet, black, or blue, and the hindquarters of the plunging boar taper away into the likeness of some high-heeled maiden falling from her palace bower. Nevertheless, the chase is real. The boar is desperate, the dogs are in fast flight through the air, and the man, the most sentimental and terrible of all beasts of prey, stands ready with his murderous spear. One may suspect from such samples the active and physical life of the Macanans, the proud beauty of their women, the vivid adornment of their palaces. The highest art of Macanaa was in metals. Here the mainland equaled Crete and dared to use its own forms and decoration. If Schliemann did not quite find the bones of Agamemnon, he found their weight in silver and gold, jewelry of many kinds, in spendthrift quantities, stud buttons worthy of any king, Antagdas alive with scenes of hunting, war, or piracy, and a cow's head in shining silver, with horns and frontal rosette of gold. At any moment one expects from it the plaintive mooing to which Schliemann, never at a loss for explanations, traced the name Macanaa, Mukna'i, the finest of these metal relics from Firenze and Macanaa are two bronze daggers inlaid with electron and burnished gold, and eloquently engraved with wildcats chasing ducks and lions pursuing leopards or fighting men. Most peculiar of all the remains are the golden mask, apparently laid over the faces of dead royalty. One mask looks for all the world like the face of a cat. However, the gallant Schliemann ascribed it not to Clytemnestra, but to Agamemnon. The unquestioned masterpieces of Macanaan art were found neither at Tiran's nor at Macanaa, but in a tomb at Vaphio near Sparta, where a minor prince once emulated the magnificence of the northern kings. Here, amid another treasure of jewelry, were two thin cups of beaten gold, simply formed and yet worked with the loving patience of all great art. The craftsmanship is so like the best Minoan that the most students are inclined to attribute these cups to some Cretan Cellini, but it would be a pity to deprive the Macanaan culture of its most perfect memorials. The subject, the snaring and taming of a bull, seems characteristically Cretan, and yet the frequency with which such scenes are engraved upon Macanaan rings and seals are painted upon the palace walls shows that the bull sport was as popular on the mainland as on the island. On one of the cups, the bull is caught in a net of heavy rope. His mouth and nostrils gape with breathless anger and fatigue. Sorry, I'm stumbling a bit. I'm living in the worst air quality that I've ever lived in. As he struggles to get free and imprisons himself the more, while on the other side, a second bull gallops off in terror, and the third charges at a cowboy, who catches it bravely by the horns. On the companion cup, the captured bull is being led away. As we turn the vessel around, we see him already reconciled to the restraints of civilization and engaged, as Evans puts it, in an amorous conversation with a cow. Many centuries were to pass before such skillful work would appear again in Greece. The Macanaan himself, as well as most of his art, is found in the tombs where he folded and buried his dead in uncomfortable jars and seldom cremated them as the heroic age would do. Apparently he believed in a future life, for many objects of use and value were placed in the graves. Well, we see that people did that regardless of whether they believed in reincarnation or whatever. and sometimes that's a sign of clinging to this material world. For the rest, Maccanaean religion, so far as it reveals itself to us, gives every evidence of Cretan origin. Our kinship, here as in Crete, are the double axe and the sacred pillar, the holy dove, and the cult of a mother goddess associated with a young male deity, presumably her son, and here again are attendant divinities in the form of snakes. Through all the transformations of religion known to us in Greece, the mother goddess has remained. And it said very much that if it wasn't for the Greek exposure of the Israelites, they might not have been, that Christianity might not have occurred. The mother goddess has remained. After the Cretan Rhea came Demeter, the Mater Dolorosa of the Greeks. After Demeter, the Virgin Mother of God, today standing on the ruins of Mackinac, one sees in the little village below a modest Christian church. A lot of so-called pagans, pagan even has nothing to do with religion really, but it's like it's the same type of religion. It's the same archetypes, we're just using different names, and so it was a lot easier for some of those people to just switch over to being Christian because it was basically the same religion. Grandeur is gone, simplicity and consolation remain. Civilizations come and go, they conquer the earth and crumble into dust, but faith survives every desolation. After the fall of Knossos, Mackinac prospered as never before. The rising wealth of the Shaftgrave dynasty raised great palaces upon the hills of Mackinac and Tirans. Mackinacan art took on a character of its own and captured the markets of the Aegean. Now the commerce of the mainland princes reached eastward into Cyprus and Syria, southward through the Cyclades to Egypt, westward through Italy to Spain, northward through Boeotia and Thessaly to the Danube, and found itself balked only at Troy. Like Rome, absorbing and disseminating the civilization of Hellas, so Mackinac, won by the culture of dying Crete, spread the Mackinacan phase of that culture throughout the Mediterranean world. Part 4, Troy. And I think we're not long to Book 2, and in Book 2 I think I'm just going to break each of these sections of a chapter into a separate program. But I'm going to try to keep it up for a few chapters here. Part 4, Troy. Between the Greek mainland and Crete, 220 islands dot the Aegean, forming a circle around Delos, and therefore called the Cyclades. Most of them are rugged and barren, precarious mountain survivals of a land half drowned in the sea, but some are rich enough in marble or metal to be already busy and civilized, as the world goes long before Greek history comes into our view. In 1896, the British School of Athens dug into the soil of Melos at Pacopi and found tools, weapons, and pottery, remarkably akin, age by age, to the Minoan, and a like research in other islands has built up a prehistoric picture of the Cyclades, conforming in time and character, though never comparable in artistic excellence, with the bioscope of Crete. The Cyclades were cramped for land, totaling less than 1,000 square miles, among them, and proved like classic Greece, incapable of uniting under one political power. By the 17th century BCE, the little isles had passed in government and art, and even here and there in language and writing, under Cretan domination. Then, in the final period, 1400 to 1200 BCE, the imports from Crete fell away, and the islands increasingly took their pottery and their styles from Mackinac, moving eastward into the Sporades, scattered islands, we find in Rhodes another prehistoric culture of the simpler Agan type. In Cyprus, the rich deposits of copper that gave the island its name brought it a measure of wealth throughout the Bronze Age, 3400 to 1200 BCE, but its wares, sedulously collected by General Lee Casnola and now in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, remained crude and undistinguished before the coming of the Cretan influence. Its population, predominantly Asiatic, used a syllabic script akin to the Minoan and worshipped a goddess apparently descended from the Semitic Ishtar. Remember, our word for Easter is related to that Aster in the Bible. Aster, a bunch of things that talk about more elsewhere, but and destined to become the Aphrodite of the Greeks. After 1600, the metal industry of the island developed rapidly. The mines, owned by the royal government, exported copper to Egypt, Crete, and Greece. The foundry at Ankami made famous daggers, and the potters sold their globular bowls from Egypt to Troy. The forests were cut into timber, and cypress from Cyprus began to compete with the cedars of Lebanon. In the 13th century, 1200 something BCE, the Macanaan colonists founded the colonies that were to become the Greek cities of Paphos, sacred to Aphrodite, at Kitium, birthplace of the Stoic Zeno, and Cuprian Salamis, where Solon paused in his wanderings to replace chaos with law. From Cyprus, Macanaan trade and influence crossed to Syria and Caria, and thence, as well as by other rowing stones, they moved up the coast and islands of Asia until they reached Troy. There, on a hill separated by 3 miles from the sea, Schliemann and Dortfeld found 9 cities superimposed upon its predecessor, as if Troy had 9 lives. 1, in the lower strata, were the remains of a Neolithic village coming down to 3000 BCE. Here were walls of rough stones mortared with mud, clay whorls, bits of worked ivory, tools of obsidian, and pieces of hand-polished black pottery. 2, above this lay the ruins of the second city, which Schliemann believed to have been Homer's Troy. Its enclosing walls, like that of Tiran's and Mackinac, were of Cyclopean stones. At intervals, there were fortresses, and at the corners, great double gates, of which 2 were well preserved. Some houses survived to a height of 4 feet. Their walls, built of brick and wood upon a stone foundation. The red-painted pottery, wheel-turned but crude, indicates a lifespan for this city from approximately 2400 to 1900 BCE. Bronze has replaced stone for tools and weapons, and jewelry abounds, but the statuettes are unprepossessingly primitive. The second city was apparently destroyed by fire. Signs of conflagration are numerous, and persuaded Schliemann that this was the work of Agamemnon's Greeks. 3 to 5. Above the burnt city are the relics of 3 consecutive hamlets, small and poor, and negligible in archaeological content. About 1600 BCE, another city rose on the historic hill. Through the passionate haste of his work, Schliemann mixed the objects of this stratum with those of the second and dismissed the 6th city as unimportant. Lydian settlement. But Dortfeld, continuing the excavations after Schliemann's death, for a time with Schliemann's money, revived a town considerably larger than the second, ornate with substantial buildings in dressed stone, and enclosed by a 30-foot wall. Of those whose 4 gates, 3 remain. In the ruins were monochromatic vases of finer workmanship than before. Vessels like the Minan were of Orchomenus and potsherd, so like those found at Mackinac, that Dortfeld considered them to be importations from that city, and therefore contemporary with the Shaftgrave dynasty, 1400 to 1200 BCE. On these and other shifting grounds, current opinion identifies the sixth city with Homer's Troy. Dr. Carl Blegen, field director of the University of the Cincinnati excavations at Troy, 1931, believes that these have shown that Troy 6 was destroyed about 1300 BCE, probably by earthquake, and that upon its ruins rose the seventh city, which he calls Preman's Troy. Dortfeld prefers to call this Troy 6. See Journal of Hellenic Studies, 56, page 156. And assigns it to the treasury of Priam that Schliemann thought he had found in the second city 6 bracelets, 2 gauntlets, 2 diadems, a flat 60 earrings, and 87 other pieces, all in gold. The sixth city, too, we are assured, perished by fire shortly after 1200 BCE. Greek historians traditionally assign the siege of Troy to 1194 to 1184 BCE, somewhere in there. Troy 7 was built unfortified. Troy 7 was a small unfortified settlement which occupied the site till Alexander the Great in 334 built upon it. Troy 8, in homage to Homer. About the beginnings of the Christian era, the Romans built Novium Ilium, our new Troy, which survived till the 5th century of the Common Era. Who were the Trojans? An Egyptian papyrus mentions certain Dardanelles as among the allies of the Hittites at the Battle of Kadesh, 1287. It is likely that these were the ancestors of Dardanoi, who in Homer's terminology are one with the Trojans. Probably these Dardanelles were of Balkan origin, crossed the Hellespont in the 16th century with the kindred Phrygians, and settled in the lower valley of the Scamander. Herodotus, however, identified the Trojans with the Teucrians, and the Teucrians, according to Strabo, were Cretans who settled in the Troad. The name Troy was traced by Greek tradition to the eponymous hero Tros, father of Ilus, father of Laomedon, father of Priam, hence the variant names of the city, Troas, Elias, Elion, Ilium. An eponymous hero, or eponym, is probably a legendary person to whom a social or political group attributes its origin and name. The Dardanelles, for example, believed or pretended that they were descended from Dardanus, son of Zeus, so the Dorians traced themselves to Doris, the Ionians to Eon, and so on. Another example is the Berbers to Atlantis. Perhaps after the fall of the Colossus, both Crete and the Troad had a sacred Mount Ida, the many fountain Ida of Homer and Tennyson. Presumably the region was subject at various times to political and ethnic influences from the Hittite hinterland. All in all, the excavations indicate a civilization partly Minoan, partly Achaemenid, partly Asiatic, partly Danubian. Homer represents the Trojans as speaking the same language and worshipping the same gods as the Greeks, but latter Hellenic imagination preferred to think of Troy as an Asiatic city, and of the famous siege as the first known episode in an endless contest between Semitic and Aryan, East and West. Well, true Aryan would be Aryavatra, Iranbeg, other terms like that, the Iranian or Persian or whatever you prefer to call them, and, the Hindu. But at this time, in the 30s, people were calling the Northwestern Europeans Aryans. More significant, more significant, more significant than the racial complexion of its people was the strategic position of Troy, near the entrance to the Hellespont and the rich lands about the Black Sea. Throughout history, that narrow passage has been the battleground of empires. The siege of Troy was the Gallipoli adventure of 1194 BC. The plain was moderately fertile, and precious metals lay in the soil to the east. But this alone would hardly account for the wealth of Troy and the tenacious attack of the Greeks. The city was admirably placed to levy tolls upon vessels wishing to pass through the Hellespont, while it was too far inland to be conveniently assailed from the sea. Perhaps it was this, and not Helen's face, that launched 1,000 ships upon Ilium. On a likelier theory, the southward current and winds in the strait persuaded merchants to unload their cargoes at Troy and ship them overland into the interior. From the charges exacted for this service, Troy may have derived its wealth and power. In any case, the city's trade grew rapidly and may be judged from the varied providence of its remains. From the lower Aegean came copper, olive oil, wine, and pottery. From the Danube and Thrace came pottery, amber, horses, and swords. From distant China came so great a rarity as jade. In return, Troy brought from the interior and exported timber, silver, gold, and wild donkeys. Seated proudly behind their walls, the horse-taming Trojans dominated the trade and taxed its trade on land and sea. The picture that we derive from the Iliad of Priam and its household is one of biblical grandeur and patriarchal benevolence. The king is polygamous, not as a diversion, but as a royal responsibility, and to continue his high breed abundantly, which is the standard of polygamy. It's not just, gluttony of some sort. His sons are monogamous, as well as behaved as the fictitious Victorians, excepting, of course, the gay Paris, who is as innocent. Oh, it's Paris in Greece. I keep forgetting because Paris is closer to the pronunciation of the old word, but Paris is Paris in French. But who is innocent of mortals as Alcibiades. Hector, Helenus, and Troilus are more likable than the vacillating Agamemnon, the treacherous Odysseus, and the petulant Achilles. Andromache and Polysena are as charming as Helen and Iphigenia. And Hecuba is a shade better than Clytemnestra. Okay. All in all, the Trojans, as pictured by their enemies, seem to us less deceitful, more devoted, better gentlemen than the Greeks who conquered them. The conquerors themselves felt this in latter days. Homer had many a kind word to say for the Trojans, and Sappho and Euripides left no doubt as to where their sympathies and admiration lay. It was a pity that these noble Dardans stood in the way of an expanding Greece, which, despite its multitude of faults, would in the end bring to this and every other region of the Mediterranean a higher civilization than they had ever known.